Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Yes? Okay, I'm delighted to be here. My name is Philip Matthews. I'm going to spend the next 30 to 35 minutes with you talking about the connected leader. It's something that's really core to my leadership practice and my business. I didn't contrive the connected leader for this morning. This is something that is core, I guess, to what I do and how I do it, to my executive coaching, to my senior executive team coaching, and also to my leadership development and the work that I do. So I'm very passionate about connecting with people and the power of connecting with people, but I'm also very cognizant, as I'm sure all of you are, that COVID has actually had a significant impact on organizational, interpersonal connectivity in the workplace. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that today. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we've lost in COVID, and I think we're at a little bit of an inflection point. We need to understand, we as leaders, how we can start to cultivate and role model that connectivity that happened so unconsciously often, so easily when we were all in a face-to-face environment. So we are at an inflection point, and now the research is starting to be published around the impact and the personal impact, as well as the organizational impact of what that disconnection did to us during the COVID period. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that this morning. But I don't really just want to go through a set of slides. I would love you to challenge my thinking on some of this. So please do, because if somebody challenges my thinking or has a really good provocative question, that's going to challenge me. And it's going to increase our learning and our understanding of the nuance and the importance of this. So please do, if you want to challenge anything I'm saying, and I'm sure there will be things that I'm going to say and challenges I might put out to you and say, well, that's not practical, how can I do that? So please put up the hand and say that. We will allow some time for that kind of questioning at the end, but please, if you want to challenge anything I'm saying, I'd love you. In fact, I'll be disappointed if we don't get this challenge, okay? So I'll be disappointed. So, who am I? I find myself in the last chapter of my career, if my career is like a book. The book started in the first chapter, if you like, or the first part of the trilogy. Might have been my rugby career. Playing rugby for Ireland, captaining Ireland, playing for the British Lions. That was my first experience of leadership. I guess my first experience of leadership was as a 17-year-old, being asked to captain Irish schools, and I went into it totally unconsciously. The only thing I had to rely on was books I'd read, people I'd seen on the television, or the captain who captained me. I had no kind of copybook for leadership. I did it instinctively. But I guess people must have seen something in me as a 17-year-old, said, well, this is the person that should lead this team. So my journey, my learning about leadership started through rugby. And then continued in my professional practice in my career, which was through pharmaceuticals, and finally into executive education, where I first came across Kieran O'Hogarty when I was at Smurfit Business School as head of exec ed there, and then laterally as president of National College of Ireland. And I really learned. I have got the scars on my back from that time in my career, but I wouldn't change anything, because out of that I became a much more resilient leader, a much more confident, competent, strategic leader, understanding at another level what connectivity is all about, on top of my sporting understanding, because business is different. And then finally, as an executive coach and as an executive team coach and as a leadership development consultant, I'm doing what I really, really love. And so we're into the last chapter of the trilogy, if you like. And doing things like this today is what I really love to do. I really love to kind of share some ideas and hopefully provoke thinking. So today I've got one big idea. And one big idea is around human connection and trying to understand what COVID has done. So to get human connection, when somebody feels a connection with somebody else, and the neuroscience will show this in terms of brain activity, when we are vulnerable in our interactions, and this is a big word for leaders often. Many authors like Brené Brown talk about leaders being vulnerable, and there's a certain amount of discomfort that provokes around what that vulnerability is. However, I'll talk a little bit about that later. But to be vulnerable, to be authentic, and to be honest, where each person is seen, heard, known, and valued. One of the things I think we should all be doing as leaders is when we get a new team member, we should sit down with that team member as a leader and tell that team member a little bit about our life journey, about the challenges that we've come through, about who we are as a leader. Here's the type of leader I am. Here's what you can expect from me, and here's what I can expect from you. We're going to meet weekly for the first month. We're going to meet but twice monthly for the next 2 or 3 months. We are going to establish a foundation of connection against which we can then challenge each other. I can challenge you where I see you falling short, and you can tell me where I need to support you more. Rather than, when there's a problem, 6 months in, I have to have the conversation. So, with everything, we need to work and consciously establish connection from day one. But to do that, we have to understand who we are, because I can't explain to somebody what they can expect from me and who I am as a leader if I haven't thought all this through. So I have to work on myself, and fundamentally, as leaders, if we're going to establish and build connection, we have to work on ourselves first. We have to understand ourselves, frailties and everything, faults and strengths. We have to understand ourselves. And we have to be open. If we're going to be, and that's the vulnerability I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the vulnerability of I don't want to do here. Please somebody tell me I'm really anxious. That's not what I'm talking about. It's actually being open and sharing some of your life story and your life history. That's when human connection starts to happen. And human connection is the most positive predictor of well-being. Humans, there's some biological things that we just cannot ignore, and that is the fundamental need amongst us to be connected. I'll talk a little bit later about the impact on that on motivation. All of us here want to be connected. I had a really interesting conversation with Kate from Intel just this morning, and we had a really nice connection because we were both open and questioning and curious about each other, and that was a human connection. We were very, very, very passionate, both of us, about leadership and about this topic. But if we had tried to schedule that over Zoom, I'm not sure, A, would it have happened? We would have said, what's the point of this meeting? I've got a busy schedule. And I'm not sure that we would have had the same conversation in terms of starting to get to know each other at that level and seeing a common interest and a common set of values. So these human connections are really, really important, and they happen so easily when we're face-to-face, and it's so difficult when it's all through Zoom. So looking at a person in the face, it's so much easier to get that human connection. It's so much more difficult over Zoom. I mean, how many of us think, if we think about our interactions over Zoom or MS Teams or whatever it might be, I would call it, and I'm sure you might agree, it's somewhat transactional. It's somewhat about things that need to be done, things that have been done, etc., etc. It's transactional versus social. And that's where we're losing the human connection. The research is coming out now. The research post-COVID is telling us that social distancing has resulted in emotional detachment, particularly in the workplace. Not so much in our family lives. In fact, there's evidence of enhanced social connection in our family and friends, because we're out in the evenings and we're playing games with our children on the lawn that we previously wouldn't have had the time to do because we were commuting. So that social interaction is actually being enhanced in our personal lives at home, but it's shifted away from our work lives. So what I'm trying to say there is humans need connection. If they don't find it in the workplace because of COVID, they actually find it in their home environment. And we need to redress some of that balance. And as leaders, we need to be very intentional around doing that. We need to promote that. People are afraid to ask questions of a stranger they've never met before face-to-face and are now working with in a Zoom or an MS Team environment. They've retreated from work. They've likely made stronger connections outside work. That's a fundamental reality. And because there's no excuse for meeting in the office, then it doesn't feel safe to show your vulnerability, to ask a safe question. You feel you have to protect yourself. You feel as though you have to have said, yes, I know all about that. You can't ask the silly question because there isn't the emotional connection and there isn't the trust. So human connection is fundamental. And the difficulty is, and I'd be interested to see what you think of this, you're not unique in any industry, but there's a huge amount of intellectual capacity required in our work, a lot of thinking required, a lot of abstract reasoning, which is a very left brain activity. However, social connections are right brain activity. And those two systems do not work simultaneously. In fact, they're antagonistic. So it's very difficult to be thinking in an abstract intellectual way, but also be very cognizant and engage people in a social emotional connection. We have to be very intentional about switching that. This is right brain or this is left brain, which means we've got to be very intentional about the purpose for this meeting or this interaction. Where should it be? What's its intention? And we have to be intentional around regularly addressing social interaction to promote emotional connection. At the moment, I wonder how intentional and conscious we are around creating enough of those intentional, social, connected interactions, whether we are over-dialing on the abstract reasoning, on the transactional stuff. I suspect we could all shift that dial a little bit to be more intentional around promoting social, professional connection. And that's not just for the sake of it. There's a real benefit, and in fact, a need to doing this. In fact, if we don't do it, there is a danger. Anybody want to challenge that? Does anybody agree with me? Or do you think that it's difficult to see the connection between emotional, social connection and, for instance, business performance? What do we think about that? Anybody see a direct link between social, emotional connection between their colleagues and business performance? Anybody want to show some vulnerability here? Yes, great.
I definitely noticed it in terms of, I suppose as a younger person, you talked a lot there about how people get their connection from home environments.
Yeah.
But as a younger person starting out working remotely, like I'm lucky to have like really great housemates.
Yeah, yeah.
It's my home environment isn't the same, so I make it my business to go into the office,
Right.
to go to work, and I made sure that when I seek jobs that's a culture,
Right.
Because otherwise, if I don't feel like
Yeah.
I'm not going to the office, I don't feel like part of a team.
Right.
I don't feel like I'm actually
Right.
have a working career.
Right.
So, and that directly impacts my motivation, my
Right.
mood, and therefore
Right.
my connections.
Wonderful. I couldn't have scripted a better answer to that. And particularly from somebody, if you don't mind me saying, you're considerably younger than me. And I cannot put myself in your shoes unless I actually ask you how you feel about the current paradigm. And it's interesting, we're still in a talent war, and I notice that sometimes we don't understand earlier generations, later generations, this young generation of people that are coming into our workforce that are hugely talented, and we don't understand their expectations because their life experience is different to our own. And we can be sometimes quite judgmental because it's not what we would have thought ourselves. But flip that around. What do they think of us? What do the younger generation think of us as a generation? What would they say? Has anybody got any idea about what the younger generation coming into this workforce, and I'm going to include myself broadly in this generation, even though I'm considerably older, I'd say easily the oldest person in this room. What do you think young talent coming into this workforce would say about our generation? What would their observations be?
I don't disagree with the premise that you're putting forward that social connection enhances business relationships and outputs, but I'm seeing reciprocation of that desire is a real issue.
Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily seeing in the workplace now a desire, particularly amongst people that were appointed during the pandemic,
Yeah.
for the level of interaction that
Right.
you're talking about.
That's
So it's a big issue.
Right.
How do you overcome
It
that?
is. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that we need to do as leaders is, first we need to be intentional. But the next thing that we need to do is understand where this lack of appetite to engage in this is coming from. What are the barriers? Because it's going to be different for everybody. Because some people, like that great question there, actually really want this, but not everybody does. So we've got to try and uncover this. We've got to build a real cause as a leader around our intentionality. We have got to be less transactional, more transformational. So let's start to peel that about, because if by the end of this conversation, we don't get some insight into that very question, in other words, we want it, but they don't. If we don't get some insight into that very question, then maybe we've not really we've shifted the focus on a little bit more. Yes?
I'm just wondering if, because I agree, I think it's hugely important, and I also agree that I think there's probably a reluctance. I'm from academia, but I think like other sectors, I think often, can you hear me? Sorry. I think often, what people think they need to do to get on is quite individualistic now.
Yes. Right.
Certainly in academia, I know, and precarious contracts and things like that.
Yeah.
So collaboration and things like that, while we espouse it, I think often it's not enacted in terms of what we expect people to do to be promoted. I don't know if people agree with that.
I think you're absolutely right. I think if we as an organization are going to promote connection face to face, and it's not to say that every single interaction needs to be face to face and connected, it's to say that we need to shift the dial a little bit. We need to start to cultivate these connections. But if we don't actually espouse that and actually role model it from the very top, well then it's certainly not going to happen lower down. We need to value it. I'm not saying we need to measure it, but as leaders, we need to be held responsible for instance, if I as a CEO or as a president say, it's really important that new people coming into this organization have connectivity with their line manager, and it needs to start from day one. And therefore, we need to be having these conversations. Here's who I am, here's what can you expect from me. We're going to meet once a week for the first couple of weeks. If we're not going to do that and do that from the top, well then it's not going to happen. So this needs to be evangelized from the very, very top. From the CEO, from the president, because organizations that don't actually want this or see the need for this as part of their culture, they're not going to do it. They're going to make a half-baked attempt, and that will lead to cynicism. So, some real challenges, I absolutely agree. Here's my challenge, though. Can you shift it 2% or 5% or 10%? I'm not saying go from 0 to 100. Can you shift it? Can you give yourself 5 years to actually shift it 20%? Because to do nothing, I think you're not going to learn anything by doing nothing. So as a real provocative challenge is to start, because this is going to persist. This lack of connection is going to persist. It's an organizational health challenge now, and you're going to see it, if not already, in your engagement surveys. People tend to rate their engagement with their organization based on their experience of their line manager or lack of knowledge and experience or relationship with their line manager. And it takes intentionality to build those connections. And I'm going to give you some good examples around how we do that, particularly in a post-hybrid environment. One of the things I do is I run a diploma in leadership for the Irish Management Institute, and I absolutely love the program. I'm certainly not doing it for the money, but I absolutely love the program. Well, it pays a couple of bills, but it's primarily because I absolutely love it. I love the impact that as a program director, this program can have on people. It can transform people's careers and lives. But one of the things that we do on the very first day, we have a little introduction, we put them into study groups, and we get them to bring a personal item with them. Something that tells a little bit about their life story. So it's a tangible object. Now, I would never ask anybody to do anything I wouldn't do myself. So I role model this on the first day, and I bring in something that is really, really important to me, and it's actually quite emotional. I bring in a symbol of rugby and what it did for me. Because briefly, as a 12 and a 13-year-old, I was a very unconfident, anxious, didn't believe in myself at all, academically poor individual. I used to walk around with my shoulders sloped. I had no confidence in myself at all. I'm not going to go through the life story of that just yet, but rugby transformed my life because a coach called me out one day in front of the entire team and said, Philip is the most important person in this team. And I thought he was talking about somebody else. I couldn't believe he was talking about me. It was the first time, age 13, anybody had shown any belief in me. My teachers, when I did my homework right, they told me somebody else had done that. There was no belief. I believed this fixed mindset narrative that I was being fed. That act, telling people my life story and the impact of rugby and then going on to do a PhD and actually being bright enough to do that is really important to show that everybody's journey faces, there's difficulty. The authenticity of showing your vulnerability and being open with people is really, really important. So as leaders, that's how we can start to build connection in our teams. Those study group members, they go into their teams and they do that for themselves. And it starts to open up trust and vulnerability from the start. They will be open with their concerns about their capacity to study. They will share their results. They will help each other, all because they've shown themselves. And nobody's trying to hide their lack of education or anything like that. So it's I'm not saying everybody should be doing this with their teams, but as a leader, you have the opportunity to start creating connection with people if you come from behind your suit of armor and show yourself and be confident about your flaws, who you are, your journey, and it will open up the conversation, real connected conversation with people in your team so that you can then have some of those tough conversations you need to have and also show that you actually do care about them. So that's the type of vulnerability I'm talking about. Connection, and particularly if you're going to get trust in these relationships, because every relationship you have with your team is an individual relationship, and trust needs to be in there. Trust in their competence, the authenticity, and that's you holding them accountable, for instance, but also connection, shared values, non-judgment, generosity, and empathy. How can you show all of these items of connection through a Zoom or an MS Team call regularly? The only way to cultivate all of these things is by face-to-face human interaction with each other, showing vulnerability and showing a sincere interest in them. I'm going to focus a little bit on empathy. There's a really good economic case for leaders showing empathy. This is a recent study, it's only 2017. In blue, managers with high empathy, 80% higher job satisfaction, 80% increased commitment to the organization, 87% made me feel more valued, 90% increased collaboration among my team members, 80% increased level of engagement and work. Whereas the manager with low empathy, much less impact. So empathy is an economic imperative. Tell me that those measures don't translate to organizational positive outcomes. Increased level of engagement, motivation, commitment, collaboration. Who doesn't value that? All through managers and leaders showing empathy for their teammates. So showing empathy is difficult in a Zoom or an MS Team environment. We've got to get face-to-face with people. We've got to look them in the eye, and we've got to give them our time, our care, and our attention if we're going to be able to show empathy. 7 critical components of empathy, and they're all around connecting and understanding, and effectively what I said earlier on at the very start was around being heard. Empathy is so important. It seems soft, and on its own it's not enough. There's no question, empathy on its own is not enough. But if we have a sincere interest in our people, we are going to promote connection. But how do we do that without compromising our ability to manage? I recently heard a story about a senior, hugely successful entrepreneurial leader in financial services. And he's somebody that is asked to speak quite a bit. And he was speaking about leadership. And he says, I don't do empathy. I don't do empathy because that would compromise my ability to make some hard decisions about people that I've had to make. And I was gutted to hear that. Absolutely gutted to hear that thinking is still around. Because what I hope we begin to understand is that showing empathy makes it easier to make people challenged and accountable. Because I built a foundation of we have these conversations regularly and we talk about this stuff. I care about you, however, you need to deliver this. And we'll have another conversation if you can't, because I'm going to support you. I'll give you all the support you need because I want to see you succeed. But if you don't, you know what's going to happen. As opposed to not giving them the support, not giving them empathy, and then just the consequences without actually any kind of support or guidance. It makes it easier to have these conversations, and research shows that as well. But how do we do that? We have to balance. We have to balance left and right brain. We've got to, for strategic, think transactional. We've got to balance the transactional accountability conversations that require cognitive intelligence, formality, measured, accomplishing things. We've got to balance those with intimate or social interactions. We've got to do both. As leaders, we've got to be psychologically minded. We've got to engage our right brain and be intentional around balancing transactional, strategic, social, connected, intimate interactions. We've got to do both. We've got to exercise both sides of our brain. So we've got to move seamlessly. We've got to move seamlessly between both of those. And we've got to pick. So it's complex for us now as leaders. It's got so much more complex because pre-COVID, an awful lot of this connectivity was happening for us. And we could be somewhat transactional and maybe get away with it. But now it's all changed. Now it's all mixed up. Now the human connections have shifted a little bit more to our home and our domestic lives. And now we've heard that some people, that's not true. So some want the social connected interaction of work in the workplace. So now it's a lot more complex for us. So we have got to shift the dial. And I'll give you one story before the last couple of before we finish in a few minutes. Sometimes you may have to climb a mountain with somebody. Sometimes it may take, and this is both metaphorical and literal. I can remember a situation when I first came into National College of Ireland. The first 6 months as president, I was going head to head at loggerheads with one of the senior people in the executive team. It wasn't pretty. Arguments in front of an executive board all of the time. He was talking outside the room, bad-mouthing me to anybody who would listen in the organization. Despite repeated one-to-ones with this individual, the behavior didn't really change. The one-to-ones were across my desk in my office. And I began to realize I could do the very transactional thing and just say, right, if this persists, you are either on a performance improvement plan or I'm going to have to manage you out of this business because this was not going to last. This could not last. But I began to realize that all of our interactions across this desk weren't working. So I need to do something different. I need to change the dial here. And I knew he was into mountain climbing, into hill walking. So I said, right, you pick the Friday. He lived up in County Down. I was in Dublin. I'll drive up to County Down. You pick the mountain on the Friday, and we'll climb a mountain together. And he probably thought, well, what's going to happen at the top of this mountain? So he probably told the wife where the will is, his ETA, if I'm not back, call the guards, etc., etc. But anyway, we walked up this mountain, and we started getting to know each other on a more personal level. Previously, we couldn't do that because everything was all transactional, and he had an awful lot of frustration. He actually wanted the job I got. So that was getting in the way of the two of us. But we walked up this mountain. It took us a good 2 or 3 hours to get to the top of this mountain. We started to get to know each other on a more personal level. And I think we both knew what was going to happen at the top of the mountain. Or at least I knew what was going to happen at the top of the mountain. We were going to have a heart-to-heart. And I was going to tell him. And I used some expletives, and I said, you know, I really appreciate your drive, your ambition. Your ambition for this college sometimes stretches my ambition because I'm thinking, wow, can we really do that? And I really value that. However, sometimes you can be an awful bollocks. And I named the behaviors. And he was able to say, give me feedback as well. He was able to say, here's some stuff about you that frustrates me. So we had a real one-to-one conversation at the top of that mountain. Now, it transformed the relationship from there on. It wasn't all sweetness and light, but any time the relationship veered, I said, do we need to climb another mountain? It became a metaphor. We didn't need to climb another mountain, but it was a reference to our conversation. And when I left my leaving day from the college, he wrote me a lovely letter and said, you made me feel better about myself. So in other words, he'd worked himself into such a corner of bitterness and anger that he couldn't get himself out. He needed to be helped out. And the way to do that was to connect with him at a different level, in a different place, and in a different way. So sometimes as leaders, where all of our interactions with somebody are transactional and it's not working, we have got to be creative. We've got to shift the dial, and we've got to think, how can I connect with this person in a different way, emotionally? Not left brain, right brain. How can I do this? I've got to get creative, because the mere act of thinking what I had to do is not a left brain activity. It's creativity, it's emotional connection, it's right brain. So I've got to be very conscious of my bias around how much time, in my interactions, am I over-indexing on left brain, logical, analytical? Do I need to bring some right brain occasionally? Not every single interaction, but do I need to bring it in occasionally? And what might be the power if I experimented with this and tried to connect with somebody whom I see demotivated or maybe not giving as much as they could? So that's the challenge for us now. We either accept the current paradigm that leadership has shifted now, people's connection with work and with their line managers and with their people is muddled. And it's up to us as leaders to create the conditions and be creative. And importantly, not take it all on ourselves, but engage everybody in doing this. We will not have all the answers to this, but we have got to create the conversation and start cultivating connectivity ourselves. So it's an organizational imperative. I'm going to skip through these because I'm very, very, very conscious of time. The one thing I did want to reference was your observations on motivation. Was really, really good. Self-determination theory is the leading edge of motivation theory now. We've moved away from Skinner and the carrot and stick approach. We've gone beyond Maslow's hierarchy, and now this is contemporary motivation theory. People need competence, feeling that they're learning and they're good at their job and that they're constantly developing. They want autonomy. They want the ability to be themselves and to some level of autonomy around how they do things. And they want relatedness. They want connection. They want to be connected with their team members, and they want to feel that sense of purpose. And that leads to motivation, engagement, and enhanced performance and well-being. So if we don't cultivate connectivity, if we don't pay attention, if we don't sit back and reflect, am I spending too much left brain time on transactional, strategic interactions with my people? Do I need to, and can I shift the dial to more social, intimate interactions in order to start creating the conditions for connectivity and motivation and ultimately business performance? That's the core message from me today, is probably reflecting on the interactions and what COVID has done. It's made it somewhat binary and transactional. People want human connection, and they will get it elsewhere if they don't get it in your own workplace. They may be happy with the connection they have at home and not want it in the workplace, or they may leave your organization and go somewhere where they can find it. We've got to start asking questions. And we've got to understand what it would take for us to spend a little bit more time connecting with each other. I'm not sure I've solved the whole problem there. I think the most important thing is we start the conversations with our people around connectivity, and we start experimenting with little things and not expect to solve all of this in one easy initiative, because it's going to require time, attention, and effort from ourselves, particularly if this is something that is somewhat unfamiliar, or we feel somewhat reticent to be as open as social connection requires of us, to be vulnerable, to be authentic, and to have those conversations that are not just about the next piece of work. Any final thoughts, questions? Yes, yeah.
You spend a lot of time
Yeah.
But we want everyone to be leaders. That's kind of a bit of a, it's not really practical that everyone is always a leader.
No, that's right. So are you saying that we need to start rewarding leaders who actually are, for instance, doing things like this?
Or rewarding the people who follow, like who participate, who actually engage with leadership.
That's a really good question because, you know, there are many different types of followership. And I'll tell you the type of followership I want is not a sheep, do as I'm told. I want a follower to challenge my thinking. So therefore, if I'm a leader, I will get the followership I deserve. If I'm somebody who is not open to being challenged, I'm going to select for sheep followers who just do as they're told. If I'm a leader who says, I want you to challenge me, I want you to challenge my thinking, and I'm role modeling challenge, well then I'm going to get the value of all of the intellectual capacity in my team because they're regularly going to challenge my thinking. We are going to challenge each other's thinking, and I'm role modeling that. I think you're absolutely right. If we really are intentional about the type of culture we want that is connected, engaged, challenging, we then need to role model it and we need to value it, and I'm not saying there's hard measures, but engagement surveys, you can get KPIs out of engagement surveys. You can start to measure the impact of these types of leadership behaviors on engagement, motivation, just the way some of that data did earlier on. You can measure engagement with the type of interactions you get from your leader. And you can do 360s. You can say, which leaders are actually promoting this more than others? How do his or her team members feel about this leader? You can be really, really open about that. So you're right, absolutely. I think if it's important, the organization needs to commit to it, leaders need to role model it, and leaders need training and development to be able to do it. Because there's plenty of research evidence to say that has an impact as well. Yeah.
One of the things I've noticed in larger companies is there's a trend towards using more tools.
Right.
We often work in very distributed ways.
Yes.
But for example, in our company, we've got the weekly check-in that
Right.
started the HR
Yeah.
mandate.
Yeah.
And I hate the thing
Yeah.
because it's like a substitute for that personal
Yeah.
interaction we
Yeah.
were talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more. I think sometimes we will intellectualize a problem and we will say we need a process for this. And when I hear people saying, well, what's the process? Or if you've got a template for that, I think you're missing the point. The point is a conversation for which there is no template. It's a mindset and an intentionality, isn't it? I want to understand how Philip is feeling today. I don't need a template for that. And I'll be honest, if I had radical candor and a performance management intentionality, empathy, holding people accountable, I'd rather have our leaders doing that than a performance management system that was tick box and process driven. Ideally, you want some measure of both, but I would rather have the intentionality of leaders holding people accountable and caring for them than a performance management template. I couldn't agree with you more. Sometimes it's a little bit of a barrier to what we're trying to achieve, isn't it? It's a cop-out. I agree, 100%. Yeah, it gets in the way, absolutely.
I'm sorry, there is a
Yeah.
counter-argument that I hear, which is sometimes people are more comfortable writing their challenge
Right.
to the manager.
Right.
I think that's a result of a different problem.
I think so. I mean, well, there you go. I would like to think if I'm cultivating the right relationship with you, you can say what you need to say face to face. And if I start the relationships off like that, or even re-establish a relationship on those terms, then I should be able to say that to you. And that is a real skill. And for me, getting uncomfortable is necessary, otherwise not doing anything different. So that's a sign you're doing something different and hopefully positive. So I agree with you. Discomfort gets in the way, but how do we grow without getting uncomfortable occasionally or always? Sorry, one final question, I'm sure, because, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose listening to you, and firstly, thank you. I think you have demonstrated a level of vulnerability, which is nice. But I think there's a missing component in the room, which is the younger cohort of people who you mentioned earlier in terms of what motivates them, etc. In my dialogue with a number of my channels, as I call them, people that are children and are now adults, and I'm trying to understand what motivates them. This kind of drive for autonomy, and maybe COVID gave them this autonomy of choice. I can work from home, I can work from wherever. I think one of the things we had certainly in the west of Ireland, in the tech industry, was in our DNA, the esprit de corps, the team, far togetherness and a common sense of purpose. And I see that being lost and, and sundered. And I don't think that has created a vulnerability for the organisations in our region, I believe. And the edge that we had in the past when an exec from the US, let's say, came, they could see a young, motivated, and there was a spirit and an energy in the facilities they visited. And that, I think, is absent. And then that vulnerability is creating a potential, I think, for us to lose an edge that we had. And I don't know, do people understand the price? And I say people as in the younger cohort realise that togetherness gave us an edge in our region. And it gave us an edge that allowed us to compete internationally with the best in the world and beat them.
Yeah.
But I think almost I want to be remote, I want to have a lot more choice, I want to go we have turned into, we're the same as lots of the other air regions we're competing against. And I'm genuinely concerned that I think there's a ripple effect and those young people aren't in the conversation.
Right. And then my challenge is we need to invest in helping this younger generation to understand the value of teams. So we need initiatives. We need to get them out of the workplace, and we need to listen to them, but we need to engage them in the activities that develop cohesive teams, because if they're not experiencing it and haven't experienced it, even from their education because of COVID, then they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know the value of it. We've got to get that on the agenda, but we've got to be very intentional about how we actually explore that, and we've got to recruit them and engage them in this. So, great, it's a real dilemma, but we've got to actually intentionally work on it and spend time and invest in actually creating that. If we've lost it, I agree, we've got to get it back. It's absolutely crucial, and I think people want it when they have it. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut it short there, but I've really loved your questions. It's been lovely to be here, so thanks again for the invite from everybody.
Absolutely.
Thank you.